So in today's video, I want to talk about what I believe is one of the most common opening mistakes that many, say, novice or intermediate players make when constructing their opening repertoire. And to set the stage, I'd like to bring you back all the way to the year probably 2014, maybe 2015. Picture me 11, 12 years old, and I was at the time playing the King's Indian defense quite a bit. I probably saw like a 10-20 minute video of it on YouTube. I thought, okay, let me give this a crack. And long story short, it was a struggle out there. And to clarify what I'm talking about, the King's Indian, of course, is the opening of the crows when white goes for 1d4 and they follow up in Queen's Gambit style with c4 on move 2. Black plays g6. And instead of maybe playing something like d5, where we more actively try and contest white's control in the center, we just sort of let white play e4 by playing bishop g7, e4, and very often a position such as the following is reached. And while I'm not necessarily saying the King's Indian defense is a bad opening, I am not at all saying that. I do want to say that I think a lot of players drastically overestimate just how strong this opening is. They might see one very classic famous game where black plays e5, white castles, knight 6, d5. These moves are all very well known. Black might play knight d7, and then they'll see at some point, like black plays f5, f4, they play knight f6, g5, g4, so somehow blast white's head off in the king's side, and then they think that every single game where they play the King's Indian defense is going to end up looking just like that. But to be brutally honest with you, at the time when I was playing the King's Indian defense, whatever video I watched, it did not even talk about the e5 plan. From what I recalled, at the time I was supposed to play this move c5, and after d5 from white, we transposed to more of a so-called Benoni structure. And in particular, I can remember one game very vividly from, it was a Sunday rapid, game I was playing at my local chess club against this slightly older gentleman, shall we say. And I remember I tried to, use whatever plan was suggested in this video of like putting a knight on a6, I put a knight on c7, I tried to go a6, rook b8, b5, but eventually what happened was something like white played a4, and like they might have went a5 or something at some point even, and I basically was just never able to get through my plan of b5. I can't exactly remember the details, of course. Chances are I was just being a bit of an idiot because I wasn't very good at the time. But this leads me to the whole topic of this video that I want to talk about, which is once again why I don't suggest most players at least play Hypermodern openings, for the simple reason that for most players it is going to be more difficult to come up with a plan in a position where you have less space than a position as opposed to where you have more space. And while at this time when I was fairly young, I did not have a coach, I didn't have anyone sort of mentoring me through like what should I play against, like which opening, I did eventually sort of figure out like I don't really understand the King's Indian, to be honest, so I switched to an opening which I thought I would probably understand better, and I had a little bit of experience before. But when I switched to it, my results got a lot better because I actually understand what was going on in my games. I started playing the Slav defense, and very often at some point playing e6, going into a semi-Slav. And while I didn't necessarily have a very good knowledge of the theory or even an understanding of the positions, just the fact that very early on I was setting myself up with a more like equal amount of space in the center, at least for me personally when I was a sort of a lower level, let's say sub 1500, I found that a lot of the plans and moves came a lot more naturally to me, again, as opposed to like when I was playing the King's Indian, where a lot of the plans were a lot more ambiguous, difficult to come up with, because as we are going to talk about later on in the video, generally speaking, when you play Hypermodern openings as opposed to more classical ones like maybe the Slav or semi-Slav defense, the weight or cost that every single move carries is generally a lot higher. But before we even get to that, I want to tackle a bit of a counter argument I've had from some students, for example, where I'll tell them, for example, like, don't play that opening, like the modern defense, for example, is one that comes to mind. It's too difficult to play at your level, play something more classical like 1e4, e5. And this might be a little bit confusing to them because on paper, at least at the moment, their results sort of look okay. They're scoring above average against like e4, for example. But from my experience, this often isn't really a very good indicator, in many cases at least, that that is a result of the player's good understanding of the opening, but rather it is a consequence of their opponent having a very poor understanding of the opening from the opposite color's perspective. And to give a concrete example of what I'm talking about, this is an over-the-board game that I played about 2 months ago at my local chess club, where I was playing a younger, maybe somewhat talented junior, you could say, right around 1800 FIDE. And for the game, what I decided to do was actually play them on defense, which I have a fair bit of experience playing. It's not, and never has been, my main opening with black, but I knew for the game coming into it that I would probably have a good chance with this opening, because generally a lot of younger players just don't have a very good understanding of how to navigate these positions where you give them so much space to play with. And this sort of goes against what I was saying earlier of how very often many players find it difficult to play with a lack of space. Here I am saying it's also difficult to play when you have an abundance of it. But for me, because I'm a bit more of an experienced player, I'm not like trying to sit here and say like I'm the most amazing player in the world, right? But I knew that coming into this, right, again, I'm repeating myself, I feel like that I would be a lot more comfortable navigating the lack of space as opposed to my opponent navigating the position with so much of it. And I was completely correct, because if we dive deeper into it, I won't explain the moves too much, but I will get to the sort of important moment where here when I play c5, undermining, or at least trying to undermine white center, my opponent basically already cracked, where he just started making a bunch of exchanges. He tried to trade queens as well with a very desperate sequence. After bishop b7, take, and take. During the game, I knew that I was doing very well. I didn't quite know how well, but I had a hunch that it might be close to winning already, despite the equal material and the queens being traded off the board. Just because look at my pieces compared to white's, my bishops are like roaring on these diagonals. I have rook potentially coming to e8 next, trying to target the white king in the center. And my evaluation was pretty spot on. Black is pretty much already, at least in computer terms, winning. I didn't end up converting it because I made some sort of mistakes later on. And so it might seem a bit strange I'm showing you this game in a video where I'm literally telling you to not play hypermodern openings. But the problem is that very often when you put two weaker players together in a hypermodern opening, moves like e takes d6, which is a clear mistake, giving up the stronghold on e5, it's not just one side making these sorts of mistakes very often, it's like both sides making it, and pretty much what you have is a game that doesn't make any sense. It's both sides just like butting their heads against each other, like throwing pieces all around like the room, and you really just get a big incoherent mess, which to some of you watching might not sound terrible. You might like the sound of that. You think that might sound fun or something, but from a learning perspective, if you're trying to get better at chess, it helps a lot if you actually at least had some idea what was going on during the game. And very often what I find is that when hypermodern openings appear, especially if you're voluntarily choosing to play them, I feel like it can be a lot more difficult to really take away real learning points from your games. But back to the other point I was talking about earlier, where I was talking about how the cost of a single mistake when you play a more classical opening tends to be a lot lower than maybe, let's say, that of a hypermodern opening. I wanted to show another over-the-board example from my own practice where we had a Rogozin opening, a fairly sort of, classical opening, you could call it. My opponent went for this variation with takes and bishop f4, which is a bit of a rare variation compared to the more, say, like forward bishop g5 line. And I remembered one way to sort of take advantage of this was to make use of the fact the knight wasn't pinned and play this move knight e4. But what I also remembered was the lines got quite sharp. I hadn't looked at it in a while. And so what I instead chose for the game was the sort of less sharp but maybe more practical, you could say, move c6, where I'm really just trying to say like, okay, I don't really want to engage in too much fury, but my position is solid, and so I'm just going to play solid moves, which, say if you play an opening that like is more hypermodern, like the King's Indian, you might not necessarily have that option to back down from a fight. You're already sort of all chips in, you just sort of need to go for it. With a more solid opening where you, again, place the pawn in the center very early on, you very often have these more like sort of cop-out sort of options like c6. And this wasn't quite the point I wanted to talk about, this was just sort of on the way to the actual point, which was after e3. The move castles, which is very natural, was already in inaccuracy. What I was instead supposed to do was play my bishop to f5, controlling this diagonal, because after e3 castles, bishop d3, now it's actually quite difficult to develop this light square bishop out the pawn chain. I tried to develop it to g4, but after queen b3, he and my dark squared bishop, I played queen e7, but now knight e5, and making use of the fact that the queen is out of the pin, now my bishop has to find another square to go to, and what I concluded in the game the best square was to actually go to c8. Why I did not go to e6, I can't exactly remember. But okay, bishop c8, bishop e6. Is there a huge difference? Maybe a tiny one. But again, that's another good thing about choosing a classical opening. Even if you do make some of these slight inaccuracies, unless your opponent is really good at punishing you, you're probably still going to be able to stay in the game pretty decently, which is basically what happened in this game. I played bishop d6 coming backwards, queen c2 happened, I played h6, and after h3, knight bd7, and takes, I was basically, and another exchange, I was basically doing fine surprisingly, in spite of again, like earlier on, getting into a bit of an unpleasant situation where temporarily my pieces were passive and my opponent maybe could have punished myself a little bit better. But again, because I laid that more solid foundation, so to speak, earlier on in the opening, it had a very minuscule impact on the overall outcome of the game, and I ended up going on to later win. However, to finish up, I want to again touch on the King's Indian defense a little bit and show one game where luckily I was on the winning side of this one, but my opponent was actually a fairly strong player, a FIDE master at the time. And what was really unique about this game was that my opponent played in a way that many King's Indian players would have played it, where he played e5, and after d5 attacked my e4 pawn. Yes, I did play g4. I've talked about this sort of idea in other videos, but that's maybe a slightly different topic for another video. But okay, this is what happened. I play h4, I'm really going for it on the king side, and probably what black should do at this point is try to stop white from continuing the expansion on the king side, play something like h5. But okay, in this game my opponent didn't know the position too well, and he instead played knight e8, which to many King's Indian players looks like a pretty natural move. Your idea is to play f5 and try and, you know, maybe get some play on the king side. And by the way, I have probably had this exact position, or maybe very similar position, like at least a dozen or so times in online chess over the years. This is a very popular mistake, it seems, among certain King's Indian players, where they're very hell-bent on going for the f5 break. But unfortunately, in this particular position, it is rather suicidal, because after a bunch of exchanges, what you're going to find is that the f5 break actually hasn't achieved a whole lot, because the white king is still located in the center of the board, as opposed to many other positions where it is castled. So therefore, the f5 break actually doesn't achieve much. White's king is very likely to castle queenside, or as we saw in the game, actually go to king d2 even. And at the very moment, it might look like black can get away with, say, taking on e4 and winning the pawn, but it's really not that simple. After knight g5, we create a discovered attack on the queen. We also add another attacker to the pawn, so at the very least, we could make a bunch of exchanges here, and realistically probably have a winning position after something like queen c2, rook g1, and all our pieces just absolutely hammering away at the black king on the king side, the exact opposite of what many King's Indian players dream of when they play this opening. And so what followed instead was my opponent admitting his mistake, going back to e7, and I just brought all my pieces over to the king side. I won't get into the details of why all these moves were played, but all you have to know is that in this position my opponent resigned. There was no way to stave off like all these sort of threats on the king side. And I've showed this game of mine, by the way, multiple other times on the channel before, so if you've been subscribed for a while and you feel like you've seen this game, you probably have. But for those of you who have not, I like to show this game for a number of reasons. One, it's a very good instructive game in the King's Indian for illustrating this idea of going g4 on the king side. But two, from a more broad perspective, it's very rare that you see like one side execute like a very natural idea in the open, especially in more classical ones, and then sort of end up basically strategically lost for executing that exact natural idea by basically like well, at this point is basically move 15, which is what I mean when I talk about the cost of every single move in the opening, right? It's like, if you play h5 here, you know, maybe you're a little bit worse, but you're sort of in the game, whereas if you go for knight e8, and after h5, f5, you're basically already losing. And to wrap up, right, this isn't necessarily saying like you cannot play Hypermodern openings unless you're on like 2000 raiders or something like that, or that in every single Hypermodern opening there's going to be a higher cost to like every single move you make than in the classical openings. There are always going to be exceptions, but broadly speaking, I'm just talking about what I found to be true looking at the patterns over the years. And again, the general conclusion I have come to from all this experience is that most players really have no business getting into Hypermodern openings. Not yet, at least. The majority of your repertoire, especially the black ones, should not consist of openings like the modern defense or like the Owens or stuff like that, where you allow white to gain a big pawn center. Instead, I would probably recommend to most players, at least starting off, you should probably play e4, e5 for a decent amount of time. I think that every player really needs to have at least some point in their chess career where they play this. c5 is also good because it helps control the center quite a bit. And even though in, say, the French defense, like where white can gain space advantage with e5, or also like the Caro-Kann, where very often white gains some sort of space advantage early on, these ones I do have a bit more belief in for the majority of players, because you gain a bit more of a clarified structure early on. You do have a bit more of a stake in the center of, say, a pawn on d5 compared to some of the other ones. And against one d4, I would probably recommend something similar as well, like going for d5 and either the Queen's Gambit Declined or the Slav Defense. You could also, I think, play also the Nimzo Indian, which is technically speaking a hypermodern opening, but very often what ends up happening very soon is black plays their pawns in the center with d5 or c5, where there's a much more equal amount of space in the center as opposed to like other ones such as the King's Indian Defense once again. But anyways, that's all I think I wanted to say in this video regarding hypermodern openings. If you guys found it useful, well, if you're not subscribed already, for one thing, please subscribe and also like the video for more content like this, and also leave a comment down below if you have anything else to add to this debate. But with that all being said, hope you guys have a good day.